Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Today, there was a pretty significant patch, the second one in a couple of days, to early access. This is mostly a buff patch, but it is not universally a buff patch, and a couple of the really highest performing builds took pretty substantial nerfs in this patch. Basically speaking, if you were playing a build that was playing the game on complete easy mode, then this is a nerf patch. If you're playing anything else, this has got a number of buffs in it. There's also a number of quality of life changes as well. Let's go through them all, including a couple of things that I'll go through a little quicker because Grinding Gear Games pre-announced those changes and we discussed them in an earlier video. So firstly, there is a huge buff that's being made to block as a stat found on gear. Block chance, the passive block, is now going to apply to blockable hits from all directions. It's no longer just things in front of you. So essentially, you can think of 21% chance to block attacks is not just 21% damage mitigation against things in front of you, it is now 21% mitigation against things that are hitting you from behind as well. This is a big deal. There's the changes to dodge rolling that were telegraphed earlier, so player size is set to 0 instead of to 10 centimeters, and additionally, smaller monsters can be pushed back when dodge rolling. The main things here is that this is not going to be enough to save you to bail you out when you are already encircled by monsters, but if you recognize that being encircled is a real and imminent threat and you act quickly, this will bail you out. Next, a really simple quality of life change, but a really important one. Inscribed Ultimatums and Djinn Barriers, they're now going to display whether or not you'll gain Ascendancy skill points upon completing the associated trial. So this is just one of those really simple things that should have been in the game from day one. You'll now know whether or not you're going to get your third Ascendancy without having to go to the end of the Ultimatum and then find out whether or not you qualify. Now the world map is being changed slightly to remove some of the things that were deemed to be less important that were illustrated there. This is just some of those pins that say, hey, there's a monster in this area that gives you some specific drop. I hope that this is only the ones that aren't particularly important because it is really useful to have pins that indicate, hey, there's something important in this area, go back and kill it. It might be one of the 10% resistance nodes, it might be one of the +2 skill point nodes, all those sorts of things. Those things are all really important and may end up being on my next character. I'll have to test out whether they're still there or not. There's some improvements that were discussed earlier to attack in place behavior. Next, we have the first significant nerf here. Rain of Arrows and Firestorm now have limitations as to just how many times they can hit the very largest foes in the game. So this is things like the final phase of the boss of Act 3, these monsters that you can end up hitting a lot of times with a skill like this. The intention is that there's still some sort of limitation. These skills will remain better against large monsters than they are against small ones, but they're not going to be utterly hegemonic against large monsters the way they have been in the past. Now here we have something that affects me playing a Blood Mage. Leech has been buffed. All it says is just Leech has been buffed. There's no numbers associated with it. Over the next couple of hours, maybe the next couple of days, we'll get a real sense as to how substantial this is. Leech is one of those mechanics that is just so hard to balance because it inherently gets much better at keeping you alive as you start getting stronger and dealing more damage. So it's something that has to be tuned pretty carefully. Hopefully they get this in a point where Life Leech feels impactful, but also doesn't mean that you can just face tank everything in the game. Two minor melee buffs here. Boneshatter is now more reliably hitting your target, which is important, and the duration of armor break has been doubled. Next, there's something that's a game performance upgrade. This only applies if you're using Incinerate, but Incinerate is now going to just function slightly differently. The intention here is that this is not a power change, but this is instead something that leaves the power almost exactly where it was, but that cuts down on the amount of computation that's necessary in order for the game to run. There's a couple of quality of life things here. Control-click shortcuts to open the currency exchange at Finn in Act 4, for example, and also a button to travel to the Trial of Chaos on the world map. And then a number of minor changes that will all be welcome and they're not particularly important, not particularly significant, but all of these will be welcome little changes. There's a small section that includes 3 lines of text, 2 about runes. So runes now sell to vendors for more gold, and also there's an update in the description to clarify that once they're socketed, they can't be replaced. Really, this system has not succeeded and the replacement needs to be added in. The problem at the moment is that you don't want to apply runes into gear in order to fix a temporary problem because you know that your gear in other slots isn't permanent. And so if you wind up getting say for instance, a ring with great fire resistance, then you've kind of ruined your boots that you might have got really good boots by virtue of putting a fire resist rune in them. Because now you've got this ring that solves the same problem and these just end up running at cross purposes to each other. The current situation encourages using trade instead of using runes as a solution in order to improve your gear. Now, trade's always going to be the most powerful way to solve gear issues in an ARPG, pretty much in any other game that doesn't apply a whole lot of bind to character effects. However, I think it's a problem when it's this much better, and changing the rune system would be something that wouldn't really improve trade. Trade would remain at its current power level, but at the same time, it would provide a substantial boost to the amount of gear that you could craft yourself, just to fix little problems like having a particular resistance that you're missing. So yeah, I would propose that they make it so that you can apply an Artificer's Orb to an item that has sockets in it already, and those sockets are filled, and then if you do that, those sockets are erased, and then you can start over on the item. That'll be something that would then, one, give a little bit more of a use to Artificer's Orbs in the late game, and two, allow players who are in the mid game to be able to get through some of these resist hurdles without permanently bricking their gear. There's a number of clarifications that are being made, and then a significant nerf is being made to the monster modifier Magma Barrier, which can be mostly found on rare monsters, but can in certain circumstances be found on uniques as well. Okay, and here we come to the big nerf here. This is only going to apply to certain builds, but it's going to be a big one for these. Trigger gems and energy gain. Trigger gem energy gain was not in the right place. We felt it was far too easy to use ailments to trigger spells. One problem with the previous system was that if we balanced it to make triggering happen in boss fights, then the triggering would happen far too often against trash monsters. In order to address this, we're now making monster power part of the calculation for energy gain. This means it's far easier to trigger skills from unique monsters than it is to trigger them from normal monsters. But at the same time, you also hit and therefore inflict ailments on many more normal monsters when fighting. Another issue was using low-level skills with unconditional ailment applications, such as Flame Wall, in order to ignite enemies for trigger gems. In order to make the source of the ignite matter, we're making the energy gain be dependent upon the strength of the ignite. We've also rebalanced all energy gain across the board. So basically, every single trigger gem that is based upon energy gain is being completely rebalanced, and in a way that is going to kind of brick a number of existing characters. I think this change is probably needed, but then at the same time, there's a real problem with it, and that is that it is very expensive in gold to respec at the moment. Really think that anyone that's been using one of these setups should be given a free respec. And in fact, if necessary, just push a free respec to every character at the moment. I don't think it would be something massively unbalancing, and will allow people to bail themselves out of the spots that they've gotten into, especially if people have spent all of their gold just to respec into one of these setups very recently, then they may not be in a position to respec back to where they were before. That's something I think is an important philosophical thing grinding gear games should take on board. Every time they push an update that's going to severely nerf an existing build, I don't think they should shy away from that when it's needed. When they do it, they should provide a free respec to people that are affected by it. That's a nerf out of the way. Let's talk about the Ultimatum changes. Here, we got another nerf, but this time it's to the monsters. Generally improved balance across the board with Ultimatum monsters, bosses, and modifiers. Mostly targeting outliers, cough cough that horrible bird, that were too difficult and bringing them into line. The monster density of Ultimatum encounters has been made more consistent. Stormcaller runes, blood globules, heart tethers, and impending doom rings no longer spawn when the player is on a lift or near the altars in the Vaal Soulcore room. Will say that those altars were particularly obnoxious for me when I was doing my second ascension. And they also fixed a bug where player minions could get stuck at the top of the lift inside Trials of Chaos. Next is a whole section on bug fixes. Now, a couple of these have a significant impact on game balance. One of these, Waystones have a chance to be found a tier higher. This wasn't working at all, so that is now going to work. It's going to do what it says that it's doing. But then there's a couple that have some pretty big balance implications. Fixed a bug where non-reviving minions were spawning a remnant from the Grim Feast buff when dying in your presence. This is about Raging Spirits. This is always a bug and it's being fixed now. Fixed a bug where Pyromatic Pact was working a little bit incorrectly. It was misreading low Infernal Flame as being 50% as it would be in Path of Exile 1, when in fact it's intended to be 35% in Path of Exile 2. The other significant one of these bug fixes for game balance is the infusion supports, which are things like added cold support, added lightning support from Path of Exile 1. These were doing more than intended when they were applied to a Herald gem. They're now going to do what they say they do when they're applied to a Herald gem, rather than providing that bonus to all of your other attacks and ending up being extremely strong. Anyways, those are the changes that have a significant balance impact. There's also a few others that are likely to affect you, like things to specific bosses, but I'll put a link to this down in the description below, and you can have a read through them. There's definitely a few that are worth checking out. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results, and I'll see you around.